Hello, I'm Siôn Jobbins. This is an article I wrote for Cambria magazine in 2007, which was subsequently published in my book, The Phenomenon of Welshness, or How Many Aircraft Carriers Would an Independent Wales Have? I'll read the prologue and then the main article. I've kept the article as it was. Some things may have dated, and only made some minor stylistic changes. How many aircraft carriers would independent Wales have? Prologue. This was something of an intellectual puzzle I set myself, but also a subject long and deliberately neglected by the Welsh national movement, including Plaid Cymru. When I heard the BBC presenter David Williams ask Bethan Jenkins, now Bethan Syed, how many aircraft carriers would an independent Wales have, it was a question I just couldn't get out of my head. Like many people, I have mixed feelings towards the military. As a young teenager, I was a member of the Air Cadets at Cabalfag Barracks near my home in Cardiff. I joined because my father had been a member as a young boy, and I wanted a chance to fly. I quite enjoyed it, but couldn't take the oath of allegiance to the Queen. My grandfather's uncle, John Jobbins of Pontypool, fought with the South Wales Borderers in the Zulu Wars, including Rorke's Drift, and came back alive. But then, I'm on the side of the Zulus, not the Welshmen. Yet, when I was Mayor of Aberystwyth, I would regularly meet up the veterans during Remembrance Service and other events, and always enjoyed talking to the old boys. So my feelings towards the military are mixed. I've never been an advocate of neutrality, as it means, in the final instance, that you expect somebody else to do the fighting for your state. Nor do I wish to see Welsh men and women fighting the wars of a dying empire. However, the most surprising aspect of my research was that the Wales could have a fully functioning military force at a cost similar, if not smaller, to the one we pay today to the British Exchequer. How many aircraft carriers would an independent Wales have? It was a combination of two interviews, one on television in English and the other on radio in Welsh, which started me thinking. David Williams, Dragon's Eye's firm but fair presenter, asked Plaid Cymru candidate Bethan Jenkins a rather idiosyncratic question: how many aircraft carriers would an independent Wales have? A few months later, another BBC interviewer, Plaid Cymru's Gwilym Owen, questioned Plaid's president, Dafydd Iwan, about the role of the military in an independent Wales. And whilst Dafydd was perfectly right to say it wasn't the most pressing or relevant issue at the forthcoming Assembly election, Gwilym was right to press him about the subject, which it seems the Welsh national movement has not thought much about at all. Now, I'm not a defence expert. In fact, I quietly mutter tame Welsh curses when I see that the history section in a shop has been colonised by the soft porn of historical studies, military history. My mutterings increase as I notice that once again, half of that space is a victim to a Second World War Lebensraum, exiling more interesting periods like Europe after the fall of Rome or East Europe post-1848 to a distant Reichsprotectorate next to the nervous twitchings of the self-help shelf. So, as a philosophical exercise, I've tried with the help of that nice Mr. Wikipedia to answer the questions many candidates and national movements leaders seem not to think important enough to ask. How many aircraft carriers would an independent Wales have? The independence movement tends to bury their heads in this, partly because of the pacifism of the movement and also fear, in Plaid's case, that the political opponents would ridicule it. The Plaid would spend X billion pounds on a Welsh army, ha ha ha, not on hospitals line. Plaid Cymru's pacifism partly stems then from the need to pacify opponents and to distance itself historically from the nationalism of the nationalist Sinn Féin IRA. It's also nationalism by proxy. Take the Falklands conflict, for example. Plaid could have been straight and said the UK had a right to retake the Falklands by armed force as part of her territory had been invaded by a military junta, but that as Welsh nationalists, they believed that this was a war Welsh men and women had no reason to be part of. Instead, they took the line that there should be more talks. Plaid used a stock line that war doesn't achieve anything, when in fact war does achieve things, which is of course precisely why people and states do it. The national movement, of course, were it confident in itself, could accuse its opponents of hypocrisy, celebrating Welsh bravery when Welsh men fight under the Union Jack, but they ridicule Welsh bravery were they to fight under the Red Dragon in the future. Or it could say that having an independent Welsh military would give the Welsh electorate the choice of which wars Wales wishes to fight and which it doesn't. Suez, Falklands, Iraq spring to mind, to name just a few. Of course, Plaid could continue to take its present ersatz pacifist line, the stand which made Bethan Jenkins' answer go AWOL when interviewed on Dragon's Eye. She couldn't answer the question not because she isn't intelligent, but more pertinently because she lacked the experience in discussing the matter. It's not Bethan's problem entirely either, because the national movement has spent the last 5 years discussing the military in Iraq, but haven't spent 5 minutes discussing what the military capabilities of an independent Wales might be. We can't pontificate about the international issues without coming clean to the public about what Wales's role in the world affairs would be post-independence and how Wales would defend its borders. There are 3 simple questions with 3 comparatively simple answers. 1. What would an independent Wales do with the existing military bases and regiments in Wales? 2. Would it have an armed force and how much would it cost? And 3. Would Wales still be a part of NATO? The answer to the first question, yes. A Welsh state would presumably keep the existing structure and infrastructure, but would become under Welsh control. This would require a bigger change in attitude than anything else. That's not to belittle a totally new change of command, philosophy and war aims, but it's not rocket science either. Armies continuously go through revision and reorganisation. The British Army itself published Delivering Security in a Changing World in 2004, which was itself built on 1998's Strategic Defence Review. Bringing the military in Wales under a Welsh chain of command and Chief of Staff would be just another revision and reorganisation in the history of the military in Wales. And heavens, if it couldn't cope with that, then what possible confidence would the Welsh public have in the military defending Welsh interests and sovereignty? Since the military structure in Wales is minimal, independence would by all accounts mean a need to strengthen its fabric rather than diminish it. At present, there is no naval facility here, and Wales is used as not much more than a training ground. If the new facility is opened in St Athan, I see no difficulty in taking one of 3 or a combination of 3 options. A. Keep the facility as an international training facility for friendly forces. B. Develop St Athan as a centre of Welsh military HQ, combining ground, air and naval command. St Athan, it's about 5 miles from Barry Docks and 15 miles from Cardiff. The third option, or an added option, would be to lease the facility out to another country, as Iceland does at Keflavik to NATO, or the Russian Navy still does with some ports in Ukraine. Wales could even decide to go under joint command with London, as the Belgians and French proposed but failed to implement in the 1930s. And so on to the second question. Would Wales have its own armed forces, and if so, how much would it cost? Wales could, of course, choose to be unique and make a virtue of being a state with no monopoly of terror over its land. By doing so, it should be the only state, excluding the microstates, not to have a force other than the police to defend and promote the democratic will of its elected politicians. This could lead to 4 scenarios. The state is open to an internal armed forces, which could destabilise the whole, making it a failed state like Somalia. Part of the state's territory would be beyond its control. The UK's lack of control over South Almaty during the Troubles comes to mind. Parts of Colombia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Sri Lanka today in 2007. The state could keep its territory intact, but a sector of the state's workings is beyond the state control, leading to wide corruption and mafia as we see in Eastern Europe and even Italy. Having no armed force also means, quite obviously, that the state could be destabilized and conquered by another state. Now, all the above scenarios are unlikely in the current climate, as is independence. But as politicians and a political party, its job is to prepare for unlikely situations. Our low birth rate will create the need for outside labour, which may or may not cause internal tensions. Conflict could arise over resources like water. What are the implications of the rise of Chinese power? Who knows? As late as 1987, nobody in intelligence service foresaw the USSR collapsing only 3 years later in 1991. And who could have guessed that English-born Muslims would bomb London buses? The difficulty with not having a military capability is that to build one from scratch would be very difficult and very expensive. And in the time it would take, it would spell disaster for the state. In many respects, the debate for independent military capability is like that for sustaining an independent agricultural sector. Things may be good today, and it may well be more cost-effective to get rid of parts of the agricultural sector. But what of tomorrow? What happens tomorrow? How much would an independent Welsh military cost? Well, how long is a piece of string? How much will the military of the UK cost in 10 or 15 years' time? It necessarily depends which party is in power and what the circumstances are. But let's take a guide, the military spend of other states of similar size and economic political situation to an independent Wales. The Republic of Ireland, with a population a little over 1 million more than Wales, spends about £700 million on its defence. That's 0.7% of its GDP. Its active force of 10,500 personnel is divided into the Army, 8,000, Air Corps and Naval Service. Slovenia, with a population of 2 million, 1 million fewer than Wales, has a military budget of £270 million, or 1.7% of its GDP. Slovenia is a NATO member and has about 7,500 officers and some 35,000 personnel, a high number partly because of its previous fragile geopolitical situation and the resultant conscription, which came to end only in 2004. Its military is mostly infantry, but it also has a small air force and naval unit. Slovene forces have served in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Cyprus and the Golan. So in the light of these examples, how much would an independent Welsh military cost? Again, this depends on what a Welsh government might believe its priorities were at the time. But let's say that the Welsh GDP is 4% of the UK's. If the UK's armed forces expenditure in 2006 or 7 was 34.5 billion, then the spend of an independent Welsh military, keeping UK levels of 2.2% of the state's GDP, would be £720 million. Now, the UK has a major international commitments, partly, I believe, because were the UK to stop being a significant military force, an important plank of the very raison d'etre of the UK would fall, something the ruling elite, and from an emotional standpoint, ordinary people, would not wish to see. This is because the military forms such an integral part of British identity. In fact, without a strong military, people would be tempted to ask what is the point of the UK? What could the UK do that its constituent nations couldn't do without it? What if Wales would take a middle ground approach between Ireland's 0.7% of GDP and Slovenia's 1.7%? In 2005, Wales's GDP was £35 billion. That's almost exactly the same amount as the UK's defence budget by coincidence. In keeping with its size and military legacy, then let's say 1.5% of the Welsh GDP at 2005 levels would give the military a budget of £525 million, which would mean a budget less than that of Ireland, but more than that of Slovenia. One imagines the Welsh Armed Forces would be about 8,000 strong, comprised predominantly of infantry, but which is an air and naval service more in keeping with Ireland's than Slovenia. Slovenia has only 16 miles of coastline. Would there be an aircraft carrier? Well, let's come to that in a minute. A Welsh Navy would, for obvious reasons, be smaller than Ireland's, but it would need to be able to protect our ports, Holyhead, Fishguard, and increasingly important Milford Haven, and our seas. And so to our last question. Would an independent Wales be a member of NATO? Again, this assumes there will still be a NATO when Wales achieves independence. Let's assume there is, which would offer us three options open to any state, the three Ns: neutrality, non-alignment, and NATO. Neutrality generally seems to be the favourite option of the national movement rank and file. That's not surprising. Plaid Cymru, for instance, was formed in 1925, partly as a reaction to the pointless horror of the Great War, and a strong desire that Wales, as the Irish say, let English men fight English wars. But there are problems with neutrality. It can sound high-minded and moral, but that depends if we believe that conflict by a bully can be satisfactorily solved by diplomacy. It's all very well being moral and neutral if your conscience, like that of the Swedes and the Irish in the Second World War, allow you to believe that sons of other nations should defeat and defend you from the Nazis. But there's not much point being neutral when you're in a minority of one. Now, I could be fighting the last law, in that a land war in Europe is unlikely and the need for traditional infantry divisions is superfluous. But that doesn't diminish the need for a military capability. Non-alignment is also popular in the national movement, again for obvious reasons. But non-alignment has proven to be a Star Wars bar style of oddballs, a carnival of dictators and dreamers, as ineffective as it was diverse. The European Union may develop into a military alliance, but that seems unlikely as it would undermine NATO. The EU was worse than useless during the Bosnian War. And in any case, who would trust an alliance with France with its ego as a leading player? The last option is NATO. This would be my preferred option, not because it's perfect, but because it has strength, which is the whole point of a military alliance. Who knows how Putin's Russia will develop? When I visited in 2005, for instance, every one of the Russians I spoke to believed there would be a dictatorship in 5 years' time. It's all very well criticizing the USA, but I'd prefer Uncle Sam even under George Bush than Russia under Putin, or China with a population of 1 billion plus under any leader. So in my view, an independent Wales should stay in NATO. But then, again, this is a decision which need not be taken now, but could be left to a referendum in the same way as any question about the role of the House of Windsor as head of state would be solved. The three questions raise many points and many answers. The next time William Owen or David Williams asks questions on the role of the military of an independent Wales, we need to have some answers. Having no military policy, or worse, saying that independent Wales would not have a military at all, is like saying that we have no schools and hospitals either. So let's return to David Williams' aircraft carrier conundrum. Well, again, it depends how a particular government prioritises its spending. But let's put it like this. Aircraft carriers are expensive, very expensive. The US Navy's Nimitz-class carrier costs a staggering $4.5 billion. There are only 10 states worldwide with aircraft carriers. And so, to answer David Williams' question, no, it's not likely that Wales would have any aircraft carriers at all, as do most NATO members. So to conclude, the more one looks at the facts rather than the cliches and prejudice, the idea of a Welsh independent military force is not only possible, it's actually the most sensible and cost-effective option. Look, there are four things to keep in mind. Wales could have a viable defence force in line with other forces, either of neutral states or NATO members, for a smaller percentage of our GDP than a contribution to the UK force. Furthermore, without the UK's delusion of grandeur and supposedly special relationship, a Welsh force would not be involved in so many military conflicts that are both expensive in terms of lives and cost. A Welsh Defence Ministry could opt out of the expensive contributions towards the recommissioning of a nuclear Trident submarine, or may wish to pool its military contribution and capability, but on its own terms. An independent Welsh force would not be starting from scratch either. Not only would it build on centuries of Welsh military knowledge and pride, but under the 1983 Vienna Convention on Successor States, Wales, as a successor state to the UK following independence, would be entitled to its corresponding percentage of movable assets, tanks, aeroplanes, ammunition, and immovable assets, military bases, etc. That means as Welsh taxpayers have contributed to the UK's military expenditure, some 4% of those military assets would come under Welsh control. For instance, the Royal Navy in 2007 consists of 88 vessels, including one aircraft carrier in reserve. The independent settlement may mean that Wales will get 3 or 4 vessels, or even horse bargaining go the whole hog for the aircraft carrier, to answer David Williams' question. The same in principle would apply to air service and army. Another more elusive but no less important point is that of Welsh prestige. For the first time since the days of Glyndŵr and the age of princes in the 12th and 13th centuries, an ambitious soldier could climb to the top of the armed service within Wales, becoming Chief of Defence Staff without leaving his or her homeland or having a conflict of loyalty. This would be a badge of a proper country, a country that can offer its citizens the broadest possible careers within its borders, culture and principles. Welsh identity would not be confined to one accepted notion of Welshness, but would encompass all aspects of Welsh expression and ambition. For the first time in centuries, Welsh men and women of all ethnic and racial backgrounds would fight Welsh wars on Welsh terms and Welsh men and women and a Welsh Chief of Defence Staff. There is the incalculable moral and psychological effect of seeing Wales and Welshness not as a badge of a weak, defeated nation, but as a nation of arms. A nation would, if need be, could defend itself. Were the Welsh language to be employed as a practical part of the force, say as a medium of instruction, let's say, the effects would be astounding. For language, when it comes to such settings, it would be a big change. The language of sedates, eisteddfodau and good little children would have a renewed muscular strength that it has largely lost with the demise of the heavy industry Welsh-speaking working class. The whole effect of an independent Welsh force would lead Welsh political and cultural identity into a new field. No more a nation chasing handouts, but a nation of diplomacy. No more cyrhech, lapdog, yearning for recognition, but a moral nation ready to take its own moral commitments. Having your own military capability does not make a nation state into a warmonger. It means that a state can choose which war it wishes to fight and which ones it doesn't. While Wales does not have its own military, answerable to Welsh priority, Alan Rees's words about the Taffy at the end of his poem, "Taffy was a Welshman, Taffy was a clown," always ring true. He fought the wide world over. He's given blood and bone. He's fought for every bloody cause except his bloody own. Cymru Magazine, Volume 8, Number 6, February-March 2007.